The sound hit first, a hard metallic crash, the kind that doesn't belong on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon, tore through the warm Texas air and scattered a pair of pigeons from the Ridgeline shopping center roof. The shopping cart Otis had been gripping with both hands skidded 3 feet across the asphalt before it stopped. His wheelchair, struck from behind, lurched forward. His left hand caught the armrest. Barely. "Hand it over, old man." The voice belonged to Brick. Broad shoulders, a neck covered in ink, the kind of stillness about him that came not from patience, but from the certainty that nothing in this parking lot was going to stop him. He stood over Otis the way a tree stands over a sapling, not even bothering to look threatening. He didn't need to. The bag. Now. Otis, 68 years old, his hands thick with the kind of calluses that come from decades of gripping wheels instead of rifles, held the pharmacy bag against his chest. Inside it were 3 bottles, metoprolol, lisinopril, and a blood pressure monitor he'd had to argue with his insurance company to cover. He had parked in the handicap space at the far east end of the lot because it was shaded, and because after 37 years of doing this on his own, he had learned which spots kept him coolest in the August heat. He had not learned how to account for Brick. Flanking Brick were 3 others. Danny, lean and quick-eyed with a smirk that suggested he found this genuinely amusing. Floyd, who said nothing and moved like someone who had done this before. And Garnet, hanging back near the bumper of a black pickup truck, a short wooden baton tapping against his palm. 4 of them. One parking lot. 15 people standing near the shopping center entrance and not one of them moving. Phones rose. The instinct wasn't to help. It was to document. A woman named Iris stood closest. She was 26, waiting for her mother to come out of the pharmacy. She had her phone pointed at the confrontation before she fully understood why, before the rational part of her brain had caught up to her fingers. She watched through the screen because the screen made it feel like it wasn't happening right in front of her. She knew, even as she did it, that this was the worst kind of cowardice. She kept filming anyway. Otis didn't beg. He'd learned that particular lesson somewhere between Quezon and the VA parking lot, where another man had taken his wallet 7 years ago. He set his jaw, held the bag, and looked straight at Brick's chest because looking at a man's eyes only gave him more satisfaction. "You don't want to do this," he said. His voice was steady. He was proud of that. "Sure I do." Brick reached out and closed his fingers around the pharmacy bag's handles. Otis held on. Brick pulled. It was at that exact moment. The pharmacy bag stretched taut between an old veteran's grip and a bully's fist. The whole scene, ugly and small and wrong in the way only real life can be. That the door to the loading corridor at the east end of the building swung open, and a woman stepped out pushing a flatbed cart stacked with cardboard boxes. She was not remarkable to look at. 5'4", maybe 125 pounds. Dark hair pulled back in a low bun, the kind a person does in the dark before a morning shift without thinking about it. Her uniform, the green polo and khaki pants of a Ridgeline grocery employee, bore a faded crease on the left sleeve where she'd rolled it up and then back down again. A name tag on her chest. Hazel. The kind of woman you passed in the cereal aisle and forgot before you reached the checkout line. Beside her, on a loose leash, walked a dog, not a pet. The distinction was visible to anyone who looked closely. The dog was a Belgian Malinois, black-coated, somewhere north of 80 pounds, moving with the compact, deliberate economy of an animal that had been trained not just to obey, but to think. His name was Diesel. He kept his nose a half-inch from Hazel's left knee and matched her stride. Exactly. Hazel stopped the flatbed cart. She didn't say anything. She didn't gasp or pull out her phone or scan the crowd for someone who looked more capable of handling this. She simply stopped, assessed, and stood still. Brick glanced over his shoulder and took her in with a single sweep of his eyes. The math was obvious and unflattering for her. One small woman in a grocery store uniform, a dog on a leash, a cart full of boxes she was supposed to be returning to the stockroom. He dismissed her before the look was finished. "Move along, sweetheart. This is a private conversation." Hazel did not move along. Her left hand dropped from the cart handle and came to rest on Diesel's back. Not gripping, not nervous. Flat, palm down. The way you rest a hand on something you trust completely. Diesel raised his head. His amber eyes found Brick and did not move. Somewhere near the entrance, a man named Raymond, 63 years old, silver-haired, wearing the kind of plain clothes that somehow still looked like a uniform, stopped walking. He'd been heading toward the hardware store at the far end of the center. He stopped now and watched the woman by the loading door with an expression that didn't quite fit the situation. Not concern, not curiosity, something more specific than either of those. He tilted his head a fraction of an inch, the way a person does when they hear a note that's slightly wrong in a familiar song. "Who taught you to stand like that?" He didn't say it out loud. He just watched. Trainer. Hazel Reed had worked the afternoon shift at Ridgeline Grocery for 14 months. She had started the previous June, a week after moving to Fort Calloway from a city she didn't mention by name when co-workers asked. She had rented a 2-bedroom house on a quiet street, 1 bedroom for herself, 1 for Diesel, and she had filled out the employment application in a coffee shop 3 blocks away, leaving the section labeled Previous Employment mostly empty, except for the words Various Government Positions, 2002 to 2013. No one had asked her to elaborate. It wasn't that kind of job. Her co-worker Daisy, 24, talkative and occupying what appeared to be a permanent position near the break room door, had decided within the first week that Hazel was simply shy, maybe a little odd, a bit too precise about how she stocked shelves, a bit too quiet in the break room, a bit too comfortable existing in the background. "She's one of those people who just doesn't need conversation," Daisy had told the shift manager once, not unkindly. "Some people are like that." Daisy had said this while watching Hazel carry a case of canned goods that was listed at 68 pounds, carrying it not on a dolly, not with 2 hands struggling at hip height, but one-handed, balanced against her hip, walking at a normal pace. Daisy had made a mental note to mention it, and then had forgotten, the way most people forgot things about Hazel Reed. On this particular Tuesday at 5:30 p.m., Daisy was near the back exit taking a late break, 1 foot propped on the concrete step, scrolling her phone. She looked up when Hazel came through with the flatbed cart and Diesel, and she called out, "Hey, you want me to bring that second pallet out?" Hazel shook her head without looking back. Daisy shrugged and went back to her phone. She was still there, 30 seconds later, when she heard the commotion. Before we go any further, if you've ever walked past something wrong and told yourself it wasn't your business, this story is for you. Hazel could have done exactly what everyone else in that parking lot was doing. She could have turned the cart around, gone back through that door, and let someone else deal with it. Nobody would have blamed her. But something in her, something 14 months in a grocery uniform hadn't touched, wouldn't allow it. Stay right here, because in the next few minutes, the people who dismissed her are going to understand exactly what they missed. And if you're new to this channel, hit subscribe and ring the bell. We release stories like this one every week. You will not want to miss what's coming. Brick had finally pried the pharmacy bag free. Otis's grip broke, not from weakness, but from the angle. The leverage was wrong, and Brick had used it deliberately, twisting rather than pulling straight. Otis's right hand slammed against the wheel of his chair. He didn't make a sound. He'd looked at his hand, then at the bag in Brick's fist, and something in his face went very quiet. Danny moved next. He was the social architect of the group, the one who understood that humiliation was a more durable weapon than force, and that an audience, even a passive one, was a resource to be used. He turned toward the people near the entrance, arms spread, voice raised with theatrical disbelief. "Anyone else see a problem here? No? Great!" His gaze landed on Iris and her phone. He walked toward her in 3 quick steps and knocked the phone out of her hand. It hit the asphalt screen down. "There you go, problem solved!" The crowd shuffled. No one stepped forward. A man in his 40s looked at his shoes. It was then that Hazel pushed the flatbed cart to the side of the loading ramp, unhurried, methodical, like someone setting down a tool before starting a different task, and walked toward the space between Danny and the crowd. Not running, walking. Danny turned, already amused. "Okay, the dog lady. What exactly do you think you're doing?" Hazel picked up Iris's phone from the asphalt. She looked at the cracked corner of the screen, then held it out to Iris without a word. Iris took it with a shaking hand. Danny's amusement curdled slightly at the edges. He stepped closer to Hazel, close enough to make the point, and said, very quietly so only she could hear, "Last chance. Take your dog, go back inside, pretend you didn't see anything." He glanced down at Diesel, who was sitting now perfectly still, eyes tracking Danny with the focused patience of something that has not yet decided to move. "Before one of us does something to your animal you're going to regret." The thing about a genuine threat as opposed to a performed one is that it lands in the gut rather than the ears. Danny had meant this one. Hazel heard it land. She looked at him for 2 full seconds. Then she looked past him at Otis, who was watching her from his chair with an expression she recognized. Not gratitude, not hope exactly, something older and quieter. The expression of a person who has seen both kinds of people in the world and is trying to determine, in real time, which kind she was. She took a half step to her left, not away from Danny. Through him, around his left flank so that she was now standing between him and Otis, the angle changed, her back no longer to the crowd. It was such a small movement that most people watching didn't even notice it. It wasn't the movement of someone adjusting their position out of nervousness. It was the movement of someone clearing a sight line. Raymond, still watching from across the lot, drew a slow breath through his nose. There it is. He had spent 17 years as a sheriff's deputy before a second career in county law enforcement. And in that time he had been trained by men who had come out of places like Fort Bragg and Coronado. Men who moved through environments the way water moved through terrain, always finding the angle, always reading the room. He knew what that half-step looked like. He had seen it in training, and he had seen it in the field, and he had never, not once in his life, seen it in a grocery store employee. He reached into his jacket pocket and took out his phone. He found Connor's number. Sergeant Connor Walsh, 8 months on the force, good instincts, not yet jaded, and pressed Joel. Connor picked up on the second ring. Raymond, get to Ridgeline, east parking lot. Raymond kept his voice low, his eyes on Hazel. What's the situation? Raymond watched Hazel adjust her weight, just slightly, both feet now a shoulder width apart on the asphalt, toes pointing outward at a precise and practical angle. I'm not entirely sure yet, he said honestly. But I think you're going to want to be here to witness this rather than respond to it. Move when you can. Connor started to ask a follow-up question. Raymond ended the call. Chechen Brick had watched the exchange with Daisy and had drawn his own conclusions. This was a woman who didn't know when she was beaten. He'd seen the type before, usually in the 2 seconds before. They figured it out. He handed the pharmacy bag to Floyd without looking and walked toward Hazel, rolling his shoulders once, the universal language of a large person announcing himself. You've got about 10 seconds to make a good decision, he said. Hazel said nothing. I'm not asking you to be brave. I'm asking you to be smart. Brick tilted his head. Because right now, you look like the kind of person who's going to end up on the ground next to that wheelchair. And for what? Some old man you don't even know? She probably works here, Danny offered from behind, his voice carrying just enough for the crowd to hear. Minimum wage hero. Classic. Laughter from Garnet, low and unhurried. Otis, from his chair, spoke without raising his voice. Young lady, walk away. Please. The please landed like a stone. He wasn't asking for himself. He was asking for her. They're not worth... Sir! Hazel's voice was measured, direct, the consonants clean in a way that professional environments train out of people and combat environments train back in. She looked at Otis, not Brick. Your bag is with the one on the left, Floyd. He put it in his jacket pocket, left side. Otis blinked. He looked at Floyd. Floyd's hand moved involuntarily toward his left jacket pocket, confirming it. Nobody had been watching Floyd. Hazel had. The crowd near the entrance shifted. Iris picked her phone back up and started filming again. Lower this time, less conspicuous. Brick made his decision. He reached for Hazel's arm, intending to move her physically out of the space between him and Otis, the simplest solution. Floyd started moving toward Otis from the other side simultaneously. It was the kind of two-vector approach that worked against people who only watched one threat at a time. What happened next took approximately 8 seconds. Diesel moved first, not lunging, not barking, executing a precise arc to the right that put him between Floyd and Otis before Floyd had completed his second step. He did not bite. He simply stood in Floyd's path with all 83 pounds of his body centered and low, and the look on his face communicated with absolute clarity that forward momentum would be a serious error in judgment. Floyd stopped. Brick's hand reached Hazel's arm. She rotated, and not away from the grip, into it, pivoting on her left foot in the same direction his momentum was pulling, using his own reach against him. Brick stumbled 1 step forward. He was not hurt. He was simply no longer in the position he had intended to be in, and the physics of it left him momentarily off balance and wrong-footed on a surface he had assumed he controlled. Danny was moving from the left. Hazel was already turning when he grabbed at her collar, a sharp backward pull. Her reaction was not a block. It was a rotation, fluid and economical, her right arm coming up along the inside of his extended arm, in a movement that owed nothing to any MMA gym, and everything to years of close-quarters work in spaces where hesitation got people killed. Danny's momentum carried him off balance into the door of the vehicle parked behind him. He caught himself on the side mirror, breathing hard, looking at her with an expression that had lost all of its earlier amusement. 8 seconds. Brick straightened. He was not a man who became less dangerous when surprised. He became more dangerous, the calculation in his eyes sharpening into something meaner. He looked at Hazel with fresh attention, the kind that stripped away assumptions, and started over. MMA. Right. I've seen that. She's from that gym in Austin, said a man in the crowd. Hugo, broad-shouldered in a Marine Corps jacket, stepping forward with the confidence of someone who had just identified something and wanted credit for it. I've seen her there. She trains at Callaway Fitness. It's just self-defense classes. It looks like more than it is. Daisy, who had appeared at the edge of the loading ramp and was staring with her hand over her mouth, nodded eagerly in the direction of no one in particular. I knew she did something. I always said there was something. The crowd breathed, the collective exhale of 15 people who had just been given a box to put this in. Martial arts, self-defense classes. Explainable. The discomfort settled into the comfortable shape of something ordinary, and people who had been frozen and ashamed found themselves nodding. Of course, that's all it was. Raymond did not nod. He stood at the edge of the lot with his phone back in his pocket and his arms at his sides, watching Hazel with the particular stillness of a man who had been handed an explanation and found it insufficient. That is not Callaway Fitness, he thought. That is not anything taught in Texas. Brick had recalculated. He looked at his group, Danny's pride wounded, Floyd pinned at the hip by a dog who hadn't made a sound, and he made the decision that was native to men like him when force stopped being cost-effective. He went personal. He walked slowly around Hazel in a wide arc, voice dropping, the audience erased from his performance. Okay, I respect that. You can fight. Good for you. He glanced at Otis. But I know that man's car. I know he comes here every Tuesday. Third space from the left. He paused. You can't be here every Tuesday. It was the most honest and the most chilling thing he had said. Otis's jaw tightened. Hazel turned to face Brick fully. She did not answer him directly. Instead, she looked past him toward Connor's patrol car, which had just pulled into the east lot entrance, lights off, rolling slow. Then she looked at Raymond, who gave her a slight nod. Then she looked back at Brick with an expression that was not anger, not satisfaction. Something quieter than both of those. The expression of a person who has already finished the calculation and is simply waiting for the world to catch up. Sergeant, her voice carried just enough. Connor had stepped out of the vehicle, hand resting on his belt, taking in the scene. 4 subjects. Victim is the man in the wheelchair. Stolen property, prescription medication, in the left exterior pocket of the one in the gray jacket. 1 subject has a baton-style weapon currently in his right hand. She paused. You'll want to note the time. 5:42 p.m., August 12. The way she said it, the sequence, the specificity, the note the time, made Connor stop walking for a half-second. He had been on patrol for 8 months. He had been given information by witnesses before. They said things like he hit him, and they took his wallet. They did not break it down by subject, approximate custody of evidence, and recommend documentation format. Connor looked at Raymond. Raymond raised one eyebrow. Connor approached. He asked the standard questions. Brick shifted, testing options, running the math on whether there was still a version of this where he walked away clean. There was not. He looked at Hazel one more time, the grocery uniform, the dog, the small woman who had not once raised her voice or changed her expression through any of it. And his face did something complicated that it didn't have vocabulary for. Garnet made a move for the exit. Diesel was already in the space between him and the parking lot before Garnet's third step, and he did it without a command from Hazel, which told anyone who was paying close attention exactly what level of training they were dealing with. No one said the word military out loud, but it was present in the air, the way certain things are present before they are named. Danny, nursing a bruised ego and a sore shoulder, looked at Hazel with an expression caught somewhere between indignation and uncertainty. "Who are you?" he said, not aggressively, almost genuinely. Hazel looked at the flatbed cart she'd left by the loading ramp, then at him. "I work here," she said. "Afternoon shift, Tuesday through Saturday." Right. You've seen how she moves. You've seen what Diesel can do. But you haven't seen what's underneath that grocery store uniform yet. And when the truth comes out, it's going to reframe every single moment you just watched. If you're leaning forward right now, leave us a comment. Tell us, did you see it coming? And share this with someone who believes that quiet people should never be underestimated. We are nowhere near done. Connor had called it in. He was standing near his patrol car, speaking with dispatch in a low voice, and then something changed in the air around him. Hazel noticed it the way she noticed most things. Without looking directly at it, a shift in peripheral data that registered before the conscious mind had words for it. Connor's posture altered by about 2 degrees. His weight moved to his back foot. He was listening to dispatch say something that was making him very still. Raymond noticed it too. He walked to Connor's side and said quietly, "What did they say?" Connor held the radio slightly away from his ear, looked at Hazel, just looked at her, a long, reading look, and then looked at Raymond. "Dispatch ran her name," he said. "They got an access level they've never seen before." He paused. "Their supervisor is asking them to file a contact report directly with Naval Special Warfare Command." The words landed in Raymond's chest like something he had suspected for the last 20 minutes, finally becoming solid. Naval Special Warfare Command. He looked at Hazel, who was 20 feet away, calmly lifting boxes back onto the flatbed cart she'd set aside, stacking them with the same mechanical efficiency she applied to everything. Weight distributed, corners aligned, the boxes stacked 3 deep without the piles shifting. She moved like someone who had spent years packing equipment in the dark under time pressure, and the motion was so deeply embedded that she did it now, in a parking lot, without thinking about it at all. Hugo, the man in the Marine jacket who had been so certain about the MMA gym, who had provided the crowd with their comfortable explanation, stood nearby and watched her. The certainty had drained from his face. He had trained at Callaway Fitness for 4 years. He had spent 2 tours in the Marines before that. He had never, at either location, seen anyone move like that. He opened his mouth and then closed it. Daisy appeared at the loading ramp door, staring at Hazel with an expression of honest bewilderment. "Hazel," she said carefully, "are you okay?" "Fine," Hazel said. She set the last box on the cart. She turned to check Diesel, ran a hand along his side, checking his ribs, checking his legs. The rapid tactile assessment of someone who had always been responsible for the health of their partner before their own, and finding nothing wrong, straightened. Floyd, still standing near his position, was looking at his own hands. He had been stopped by a dog that had not made a sound, had not been given a verbal command, had simply moved to the exact right position at the exact right moment and held it. Floyd had been in 3 fights in the last 2 years. He had never been stopped like that. He kept looking at his hands, as though trying to understand where, exactly, the calculation had gone wrong. Brick was by the patrol car now, Connor beside him. Garnet and Danny stood 6 feet away, the fight already over, in the way that matters. Not in bodies on the ground, but in the specific silence of men who have encountered something they cannot categorize and find the absence of category more frightening than losing. Brick looked at Hazel one last time. She was pushing the flatbed cart back toward the loading door. He said, not loudly, not to the crowd, just out loud, to no one, "Who is she?" Raymond, close enough to hear, did not answer. He watched Hazel reach the loading door, pull it open with her free hand, and guide the cart through. Just before the door closed behind her, she paused, barely a half second, the pause of a person checking a room before leaving it, and her eyes swept the parking lot one final time. They landed on Otis. He had his pharmacy bag back. Connor had recovered it from Floyd's pocket and returned it without ceremony. Otis was holding it against his chest the same way he had been holding it at the beginning, his fingers tight around the handles. He was looking at Hazel with an expression that Raymond, who had seen many things in many years, thought he recognized. It was the expression of a man who had known people like her before, who had served alongside people like her, or maybe had been commanded by people like her, or had simply encountered in his life the type of person who shows up when things go wrong and doesn't talk about it afterward. It was recognition, and it was gratitude, and it was something else. A kind of sadness that came from knowing what being that type of person costs. Otis raised one hand from the bag's handles, two fingers pressed together, a small salute. The kind of salute that meant something specific between people who had spent time in certain places. Hazel looked at it. Her eyes didn't change expression. Her hand came up, two fingers pressed together, in return, just for a moment. Then the loading door closed. Raymond stood in the east parking lot of the Ridgeline Shopping Center, the August heat pressing down on the asphalt, and turned the last 20 minutes over in his mind. Not the combat. He had seen combat in various forms, and what Hazel had done was notable, but not inexplicable to a person of his background. What he was turning over was the combination of things. The way she stood, the K9, the lethality paired with the absolute restraint. The fact that she had moved Floyd's bag location without being told, had clocked all four subjects simultaneously, had spoken to Connor in the compressed sequential language of someone who briefed operators rather than filed police reports. Naval Special Warfare Command. There were tiers within that designation. Most people didn't know the layers. Most people heard Navy SEALs and thought they knew what they were talking about. Raymond knew better. He'd had colleagues who'd worked with Joint Special Operations Task Forces, who came back quiet and different, who used certain acronyms that didn't appear in the public record. DevGru was one of them. Tier 1, the top of the architecture. He stood there with the August heat and the smell of asphalt and the sound of Connor completing his arrest paperwork, and he thought, that woman is not working in a grocery store because she ran out of options. She was working in a grocery store because she chose to be invisible, and someone, or something, had just made that harder. He took out his phone again. Not Connor's number this time, a number he had stored years ago and never expected to use. He pressed call. It rang twice. A voice answered, professional and brief. "Raymond," he said, "I think you should know. She's in Fort Calloway, Ridgeline Shopping Center. And she just handled 4 armed subjects in a parking lot without a weapon, without backup, and without anyone here even knowing her name." He listened. "No, she doesn't know I'm calling." He paused. "I think that's exactly why I should." He ended the call, pocketed the phone, walked slowly toward the patrol car where Connor was finishing up. Neither of them noticed, because no one ever noticed Hazel Reed, that she had appeared briefly in the small, rectangular window of the loading door, watching the lot, watching Raymond, watching him put the phone away. Her face, behind the glass, was still. Diesel sat beside her left knee, his ear turned slightly in Raymond's direction. Then she stepped back from the window, and the loading corridor was empty again. The arrest took 40 minutes. Brick, Danny, Floyd, and Garnett were cited and processed with the particular joylessness that characterized such events. Rights read, property documented, patrol car doors closed with a sound like a period at the end of a sentence. A second unit had arrived to assist, its presence drawing a few more people out of the shopping center entrance. Someone had already posted Iris's video. She had not taken it down, despite Danny's best efforts, and it had acquired, in the time between the incident and Connor completing his paperwork, several thousand views and a comment thread that was, unusually for the internet, almost uniformly in agreement about what it had witnessed. The top comment read, "That's not MMA. I don't know what that is, but that is not MMA." Hugo read it on his phone, standing near his truck, and said nothing. He looked at the loading door. He looked back at his phone. He thought about the 2 years he had spent as a rifleman and the things he had been taught about economy of motion and situational awareness and how those qualities were trained rather than natural, how they left marks on a person the way a river left marks on stone. He thought about the specific way Hazel had absorbed the chaos of 4 aggressive men and a crowded parking lot and organized it into a sequence of decisions that each built on the last. He closed the comment thread and drove home. Otis was the last to leave. Connor had offered to call someone, offered to drive him, offered the standard catalog of follow-up resources. Otis had declined each item with the polite brevity of a man who had been declining institutional assistance for decades. He tucked the pharmacy bag into the back pocket of his chair, adjusted his grip on the wheels, and began moving toward the handicap space where his adapted van was parked. He stopped once. He turned the chair to face the loading door. The window was empty. The door was closed. The loading ramp held nothing but a flatbed cart with neat stacks of cardboard boxes positioned with mechanical precision at a slight angle to the wall. A detail that, if you knew what you were looking at, suggested the person who'd left it there had automatically positioned it to maximize the sightline from the door. Otis looked at it for a moment. Then he reached into his shirt pocket and closed his fingers around something small and cool, a silver challenge coin, the face of it worn smooth by years of being handled. One side bore the insignia of the 173rd Airborne Brigade, the other, the year, 1968. He held it for a moment. Then he placed it carefully on the flatbed cart, on top of the nearest box, weighted with a small piece of loose asphalt from the parking lot so it wouldn't blow away. He didn't write a note. The coin said enough. He turned the chair and made his way to his van, the afternoon sun casting long shadows east across the lot. And by the time he had the lift deployed and his chair locked in and the van running, the parking lot had resumed its ordinary Tuesday logic. Carts being returned, children being buckled in, the whole unremarkable machinery of a small Texas town going about its business as though nothing unusual had occurred. As though a woman named Hazel had not stood between a 68-year-old veteran and four men who intended him harm and resolved the situation in 8 seconds with the calm precision of someone who had spent years doing far more difficult things in far less forgiving places. Raymond watched Otis's van pull out of the lot. He turned and looked at the loading door one final time. Then he walked to his car, got in, and sat with his hands on the wheel for a long moment before starting the engine. "She's gonna hate this," he said to no one. He started the car and drove. Inside the stockroom, Hazel broke down the last of the cardboard boxes. She fed them into the compactor one at a time, the machine cycling with a steady hydraulic groan. Diesel lay on the cool concrete floor near the industrial shelving, his chin on his paws, watching her the way he always watched her, with the absolute undemanding attention of an animal that had decided years ago that where she was where he would be. When the last box was done, she stopped. She stood in the middle of the stockroom in the fluorescent-lit quiet, and she closed her eyes for exactly 3 seconds. Then she opened them, brushed the cardboard dust from her hands, and went to check the receiving inventory for tomorrow's delivery. She did not look at the loading door window. She did not need to. She already knew Raymond had made a call. She had known the moment she saw his posture change at the phone. She had cataloged it the same way she cataloged everything. A data point, filed, implications noted, response deferred. There would be consequences eventually. There always were when someone who had worked very hard to be unnoticed did something that made them visible. The question was what kind of consequences, and when, and from which direction. She filed that question, too, in the same internal cabinet where she kept the things she was not ready to open, and she went back to work. The stockroom was quiet in the way that only large institutional spaces can be quiet, the kind of silence that isn't empty but loaded. The hum of refrigeration units and the distant beep of a checkout scanner at the front of the building threading through the air like a pulse. Hazel broke down the last cardboard box, fed it through the compactor, and listened to the hydraulic cycle with a sound like patience being compressed into something smaller than it wanted to be. Diesel lay on the cool concrete floor, his chin between his paws, amber eyes tracking her movements with the patient attention he had never once in 4 years stopped giving her. He had been doing it since Kandahar. He would likely do it until one of them stopped being able to. She washed her hands at the utility sink, dried them on the shop towel hanging from the shelf. Then she stood for a moment with her hands braced against the edge of the sink, looking at her own forearms under the fluorescent light. The left sleeve of her uniform had rolled down at some point during the last hour. She didn't remember doing it. Her hands had done it on their own. The same hands that 14 months ago had also started leaving the coffee maker on the right side of the counter and the shoes near the left wall, and the blinds at 3/4 close rather than fully shut. Small adjustments, habits her body made without consulting her mind. The infrastructure of a life being rebuilt piece by careful piece into something that resembled ordinary. She pushed the sleeve back up to the elbow. The underside of her left forearm bore a network of fine white lines, old scars, not dramatic ones, the kind that came from shrapnel moving at angles rather than straight, the kind that resulted in surgical extractions rather than clean exits. Each line had a date attached to it in her memory, a set of coordinates, a sequence of decisions that had led to a particular position in a particular place at a particular hour. She did not visit those memories deliberately. They came when they came. On her left shoulder, hidden now by the uniform fabric, was something she didn't think about unless she was made to. She pulled the sleeve down. Outside, through the small rectangular window of the stockroom door, the last of the late afternoon sun was cutting across the asphalt at a long angle, turning the parking lot into a geometry of light and shadow. The patrol cars were gone. Otis's van was gone. The flatbed cart was still there near the loading ramp. And on top of the nearest stack of boxes, weighted by a small piece of asphalt from the parking lot, sat a silver challenge coin. She had seen it an hour ago when she had briefly checked the lot from the window. She had stood at the glass and looked at it for a long moment, longer than she had intended to stand there, because standing at windows had not been her habit for 14 months. Looking out was a habit. It was a different thing from lingering. She had not gone out to retrieve it. She wasn't sure she was ready to hold it yet. Diesel raised his head from the floor and looked at the door. "I know," Hazel said, not a command, just an acknowledgement that she heard what he was telling her, and she agreed, and they would deal with it when they dealt with it. 3 days passed without incident, which was not the same as 3 days without consequence. The video that Iris had recorded was the problem, or rather, it was the solution that created the next problem, and the problem after that. By Wednesday morning, it had cleared 300,000 views and was climbing in the particular exponential way that happened when a clip landed in multiple audience streams simultaneously. The veteran community, the self-defense community. The people who forwarded things to their group chats with the caption, "Watch this," and the much larger, harder-to-define category of people who recognized something true when they saw it, even if they couldn't name what the truth was. The comment that had started as the top-ranked reply, "That's not MMA. I don't know what that is, but that is not MMA," had been succeeded by a thread of progressively more specific observations. A former Marine had written with some precision about the way Hazel had used Danny's extended reach against him. That technique is from the MCMAP curriculum, Advanced Combatives. You don't learn that at a gym. A former Army Ranger had replied, "That's not MCMAP. That's something else. I've seen that in a classified training context. I can't say more than that." A woman who identified herself only as a Navy wife had posted, "My husband won't tell me why, but he watched this video 4 times. 4 times. He never does that." The video had been shared by 2 veterans organizations, a Blue Star Families affiliate and a local Fort Calloway news blog that had run the headline, "Who is Ridgeline's Mystery Woman? Local Hero Stops Assault, Declines Interview." The article contained exactly 3 facts. The assault had occurred, it had been stopped, and the woman responsible had refused to speak with any reporter who showed up at the store. 2 reporters had shown up. Hazel had said to both of them in the same even tone she used for inventory discrepancies, "I work in the stockroom. You need to speak with the manager about media inquiries." And then she had gone back to work. The manager, Albert, round-faced and honest, who had hired Hazel because her reference letters were oddly institutional, and her availability was completely open, was fielding 5 calls a day, and had placed a handwritten note on the employee bulletin board that read, "Please do not speak with media on behalf of the store. See Albert." He had not spoken with Hazel about the incident directly, which was a decision he had reached by looking at her face the morning after, and concluding with the hard-won wisdom of a man who had managed 12 employees for 9 years, that some conversations were better left unstarted. Daisy, who had the specific inability to leave things alone that distinguished truly extroverted people from merely social ones, had waited until the 3rd morning before saying anything at all, which was, for Daisy, an act of extraordinary restraint roughly equivalent to someone else holding their breath for an hour. "You could have told us," she said carefully, while they were counting inventory in aisle 7. Hazel moved a can of soup 2 inches to the right to align with the shelf marker. "Told you what? That you could..." Daisy gestured with her clipboard in a way that covered approximately the distance between, was in the military and is apparently capable of things most people would struggle to believe. "You know, it didn't come up." Hazel moved to the next section. "It never comes up because you never let anything come up. Daisy followed her. Hazel, people are talking about you. The video has 340,000 views. Hugo, the guy from the parking lot, he came into the store yesterday and asked Albert if he could speak with you. He said he'd been in the Marines and he wanted to. I know about Hugo. Daisy stopped. You know he came in? I saw him in the parking lot camera feed when he pulled in. A pause that measured itself in canned goods. Tell him I appreciate it, but I don't have anything to say. Daisy stared at her for a moment with the expression of someone who had reached the far edge of ordinary social tools and found nothing useful there. Hazel, what happened in that parking lot? She stopped, then started differently. I've known you 14 months, and I have never once seen you. Another stop. Who were you before you came here? The question landed in the air between them. Hazel counted a row of canned tomatoes and wrote a number on her clipboard. Someone who needed a quiet Tuesday, she said, and moved to the next aisle. Daisy stood in aisle 7 alone, holding her clipboard, and found she did not have a follow-up. She held that empty space for a long moment, which was unusual for her, and which she would think about later. Not the absence of the answer, the weight of the question that had been returned to her, unbroken, like a stone thrown at water that hadn't made a ripple. The video had also reached a person named Russell Webb, who ran the county's Disabled American Veterans chapter out of a rented room behind the American Legion Hall on Route 9. Russell was 61, a Gulf War veteran with a back injury that had been managed and mismanaged by the VA for 30 years, and he had a specific and finely calibrated sensitivity to stories in which disabled veterans were treated as targets rather than people. He watched the video 3 times on the evening it came to him. Then he called the Callaway County Sheriff's Office, not to file a complaint. The complaint had been filed, but to inquire whether the charging documents would benefit from the chapter's formal advocacy and whether the victim had been connected with the services available to him. Connor Walsh, who had been on duty when the call came in, said he would pass along the contact information. He also said because he was an honest person who understood that what happened in the parking lot was bigger than the charging documents, there was another person involved. She won't want advocacy, but she might want to know that people noticed what she did. Russell Webb wrote a letter. He mailed it to the Ridgeline Shopping Center addressed to the employee named Hazel, care of management. Albert received it, read the first 2 lines to confirm it was not media inquiry, and left it in Hazel's employee mailbox without comment. Hazel found it on Friday morning between a payroll update notice and a reminder about the break room refrigerator cleaning schedule. She read it once, standing at the mailboxes. She folded it and put it in her jacket pocket. She did not say anything about it to anyone. That evening, she sat at the kitchen table in the 2-bedroom house on the quiet street and held the letter for a while without reading it again. Diesel lay under the table with his chin on her left foot. The house was the way she had made it. Spare, clean, organized with the instinctive efficiency of someone who had spent years living in spaces where every item had to earn its place. 1 shelf of books, 1 photograph on the kitchen counter, not framed, tucked under the edge of a coffee mug, the kind of placement that was not quite displaying something and not quite hiding it. The placement of someone who needed to know it was there without having to look at it directly. The photograph was of 6 people, in desert kit, standing in front of a vehicle she did not name in her thoughts. 3 of the 6 were no longer alive. She was one of the 3 who were. She put the letter in the drawer where she kept things that were not ready to be thrown away and not ready to be dealt with. Then she made dinner, fed Diesel, and went to bed at the time. She always went to bed, and slept the way she had learned to sleep, lightly, completely, and with the particular alertness that looked from the outside like stillness. Hugo Cassian came back Wednesday afternoon not to speak with Albert but to buy groceries, which was either sincere or tactical and ended up being both. He found Hazel in the produce aisle and stopped his cart 6 feet from her, the specific distance of a person who has decided to be respectful about proximity, and said, I told everyone it was MMA. Hazel placed a display of apples back in alignment. I know now that it wasn't, he said. I didn't know at the time, but I should have looked harder before I put a label on something I didn't understand. He paused. I was in the Marines for 4 years. I should have known the difference. She looked at him. Hugo Cassian was 34, broad-shouldered, the kind of man who had always been the largest person in rooms until he went to basic training and discovered rooms contained different scales. He had something in his face that was not quite embarrassment and not quite admiration, and was actually some combination of both that didn't have a clean word for it. You were trying to make sense of something in real time, she said. Most people do that. I gave people a wrong answer because it was a comfortable one. Yes. She held his eyes for a moment, not unkindly. That's also something most people do. He absorbed this. I wanted to say I was wrong. Noted. She moved the cart to the next display. He watched her go. He stood in the produce aisle for a moment longer, then put 3 apples in a bag that he didn't need, and went to the checkout line. And he thought about what she had said, trying to make sense of something in real time. And he thought about the parking lot and the video and the specific 4-second sequence where Hazel had absorbed Brick's approach and Danny's lunge and had reconfigured both threats into controlled outcomes without making a sound. And he thought about the years he'd spent in the Marines learning to be fast and strong and effective, and the gap he was now staring at between that and whatever she had spent years becoming. He paid for his apples and left. He signed up for the County Veteran Services volunteer list 2 days later. Not because it was connected exactly, but because some experiences reorganize the internal filing system and certain things end up in different places. It was the following Thursday, 8 days after the parking lot, when things stopped being quiet. The day started ordinarily. Hazel clocked in at 1 in the afternoon, checked the receiving log, and began working through the afternoon delivery. The truck had been 30 minutes late, which pushed the entire schedule forward, which meant she was still at the east parking lot, loading dock at 5:15 p.m., when the black pickup truck pulled in. She recognized it before she saw who was driving. The truck. The same one that had been parked near Garnett's position 8 days ago. The familiar geometry of it landing in her peripheral vision with the particular weight of information that has been filed and not discarded. Her hands did not stop moving. She kept working the pallet jack, kept her breathing at rest pace, kept the manifest in her left hand. But her eyes had already begun the recalculation, reading the lot in sections the way she had been trained to read terrain. Entry points, exit angles, distance to cover, number of contacts, camera fields. 2 people got out of the truck, not Brick, not Garnett. Those 2 were occupied with legal proceedings. These were different men. Late 20s, one tall with a flat expression that came from having been used as muscle for long enough that it had stopped requiring thought. The other was smaller, quick-eyed, moving with the awareness of someone who had been sent here rather than having chosen to come. Danny had made a call from wherever he was being processed, and the call had been answered by someone who had calculated that a grocery store employee in a torn uniform might be more manageable than the parking lot footage suggested. The calculation was wrong, but it would take them a few minutes to understand that. Hazel set the pallet jack against the dock wall. Diesel was already on his feet, already at her left knee, the leash slack, his amber eyes running the same assessment hers were. The tall man walked toward the loading dock with the directness that left no ambiguity about purpose. The smaller one hung back near the truck, watching the lot, looking for cameras, looking for police, running the same calculation Hazel had already finished. "You're the one from the video," the tall man said, stopping 8 feet out. "My friend Danny asked me to pass along a message." "I'm working," Hazel said. She picked up the pallet jack. "He said the situation from last week? It's not finished." He took 1 step closer. "He also said to remind you that this is a small town. People have to live somewhere. Your friend Danny is facing 3 charges, including theft from a disabled veteran," Hazel said, her voice carrying the same flat utility as a measurement reading on a form. "Adding a witness intimidation charge to that stack would be an error on his part. And yours." The tall man's jaw moved. He was accustomed to a certain kind of conversation where he spoke, and the room got smaller. Hazel had not gotten smaller. She had simply continued existing at the same size, in the same posture, with the same level of ambient awareness that had been present throughout the parking lot incident. The kind that registered to trained people like a frequency slightly outside the normal range, audible only to those with the equipment to hear it. "You're one woman," he said, "with a dog." Hazel looked at him for 2 seconds. Then she looked past him, at the camera on the loading dock corner. At Raymond's car, which had been parked at the far end of the east lot every afternoon for the past 8 days. Raymond in the driver's seat with a direct sightline, a paper coffee cup in his hand, and the patience of a man who had decided without being asked that his afternoons would be spent here. At Connor's patrol car, which had pulled into the far entrance 45 seconds ago, she had heard the engine, identified it by the slight irregularity in the idol that Connor's unit had carried since the first day she'd heard it. She looked back at the tall man. "You should leave now," she said. The smaller man by the truck had found Connor's vehicle. He said something low and fast. The tall man looked at the patrol car, looked at Diesel, looked at Hazel one more time, and the arithmetic resolved itself into the only outcome arithmetic has when a person does it correctly. They left. Hazel watched the truck exit. She held the pallet jack for a moment, her hands loose on the handles, and absorbed the specific weight of the confirmation. This was not finished, and it was not going to finish quietly, because what had happened in the parking lot had not just been 4 men with a pickup truck. It had been a symptom of something with more organizational structure and more reach than individual entitlement. The thread led somewhere, and the somewhere had fingers in Fort Calloway's smaller economies and was not going to release them because a grocery store employee had been inconvenient. She was going to have to decide something. She set the pallet jack against the dock wall and sat on the edge of the loading ramp, her feet hanging over the asphalt. Diesel settled beside her, his shoulder against her left hip, the familiar weight of him. She put her hand on top of his head without deciding to. Raymond was crossing the lot toward her. He walked with the slightly deliberate gait of a man who had adapted to a back injury in his 50s so naturally that most people wouldn't notice it unless they knew to look. He stopped 6 feet from the dock, hands in his jacket pockets, and looked at her with the expression she had cataloged as his baseline over 8 days of observation. Direct, unhurried, making no claims on her time or attention. "You saw them," she said. "Their plates are already logged." A pause. "I've also been running a second vehicle. Dark sedan, different driver each time. Been circling this block for 3 days running." He let that settle. "Brick is connected to something with more resources than 4 men and a pickup." "I know." She looked at the exit where the truck had gone. "I've known since the second day. You've been deciding whether to relocate." It wasn't a question. He had read it in her the way experienced people read the specifics of someone who is quietly making calculations about their continued presence somewhere. "Yes." "And?" She looked at him. Really looked at him. The kind of look she had been careful not to give anyone in Fort Calloway because it was the kind of look that acknowledged a person as fully real and started conversations she wasn't prepared for. He met it without adjusting, which was something not everyone managed. "You called someone," she said, "after the incident." "Yes." "Who?" "Someone who was owed a call." He held her eyes. "They won't show up here uninvited, but they wanted to know you were all right." Something in the careful neutrality of her face shifted by a fraction, the equivalent for her of a much larger movement. She looked back at the lot. "You were law enforcement." 17 years, sheriff's deputy, then senior investigator. Retired 11 years ago. He paused. "Before that, I was Army. 82nd Airborne. 1 tour in the Gulf. Nothing classified." He said it the way military people said true things, plainly, without decoration. "I'm not pretending we're the same. I wasn't going to say that." "No," he said. "You weren't." He looked at the loading dock camera. "The men who were here today. They'll send someone else. Whoever Brick's connected to doesn't stop because of inconvenience." He shifted his weight slightly. "There are people who would like to help, if you'd let them, on your terms." Hazel was quiet for long enough that the silence acquired a shape. "What kind of help?" she finally said. He told her, and she listened. 2 days later. A Saturday. The lot busier with weekend traffic, carts crossing in both directions, the sound of children and car doors, and the mid-afternoon ordinary business of a Texas town moving through its routines. Brick made his final, and most telling, mistake. He had been released on bail Thursday morning. His attorney had spent the better part of 2 days explaining in variations that circled the same point from multiple angles that the charges he was facing represented a situation whose best possible outcome required him to do approximately nothing for the foreseeable future. Brick had listened with the surface compliance of a man who had already made a decision below the level of listening. What had happened in the parking lot 8 days ago was not, in Brick's assessment, a legal problem. The legal problem was manageable. What was not manageable was the specific experience of having been reduced, not defeated, which was a concept he had vocabulary for, but reduced, made smaller in front of an audience that included strangers, by a woman in a grocery store uniform who had done it without raising her voice or changing her expression. That was a different category of problem. He came alone. He came in the middle of the day on a Saturday, the lot full, witnesses everywhere. because he understood at some level that operated below the level of deliberate thought that an audience was simultaneously exposure and protection. He wore civilian clothes. He carried nothing visible. He walked to the loading dock like a man who had convinced himself he was being reasonable, which is one of the more dangerous things a person can convince themselves of. Hazel was at the dock, signing off on a delivery manifest, the truck driver beside her checking his clipboard with the impatience of someone 30 minutes behind schedule. Diesel's ear rotated before she heard anything. She set the manifest on the cart beside her and looked up. Brick stopped 10 feet from the dock. He put both hands up, palms out. "I need 5 minutes," he said. "That's all." She looked at him. "I'm not here to start anything." He dropped the hands. Something was working in his face, below the usual register, below the architecture of toughness he had spent years constructing. That had not been there a week ago. "I need to understand something." "The charges are in the hands of the Callaway County District Attorney's Office," Hazel said. "If you want to discuss—" "That's not what I want to discuss." He was 8 feet away now, and she could see the thing in his face clearly. Not remorse performing for an audience, but something private and uncomfortable. The expression of a man who had looked at a piece of information and found it did not fit the container he had built for himself over a lifetime. That man in the wheelchair. Otis. He's a veteran. Hazel said nothing. "I looked him up. Otis Marshall. Kisan, 68. He was in the Marines." Something moved through his face that was complicated and not simple. "I didn't know that. I knew he was old. I knew he was in a wheelchair. I didn't know what he had—" He stopped. "My grandfather was in the Marines. He died when I was 12. He never talked about the war. He stopped again. The architecture slipped slightly. "He just carried it around quietly, and I never asked. And then he was gone." The parking lot continued its Saturday business around them, indifferent and ongoing. Carts rattling, an announcement from the store intercom, the sound of a car alarm briefly triggered and then silenced. None of it touched the 8 feet between Hazel and Brick. "That doesn't change what you did," Hazel said. "I know." He looked at his hands. The same involuntary movement Floyd had made a week ago, standing in the lot with nothing left to show for what he'd thought was control. "I know it doesn't, but I need you to know that I wouldn't have, if I had known." Hazel held his eyes. "You don't need to know what a person has done," she said, "to know that what you're doing to them is wrong." It was not delivered as a lesson. It was not performed for him. It landed the way observations land when they come from people who have spent time in places where the gap between right and wrong is not a philosophical abstraction, but a thing with immediate physical consequences. Landed as a fact, delivered directly, addressed to the specific person in front of her. Brick received it the way a person receives something they cannot argue with, without arguing against their own better self. He nodded once. Connor had arrived. He was standing at the edge of the dock area, hand resting on his belt, watching the conversation with the careful attention of a man who is learning to read situations rather than just respond to them. He looked at Hazel with the unspoken question in his posture. "Do you need me to step in?" And she answered it with a slight movement of her head. "He came to talk," she said. "He's on bail. He should go home." Brick looked at Connor. Connor looked at Brick with the kind of look that communicated without any particular drama the entire architecture of the situation and what it required. "Walk away from this lot and don't come back," he said. "Are we clear?" Brick looked at Hazel one more time. He opened his mouth to say something else, and what came out instead of words was the thing itself, the unguarded expression of a man who has spent years being the largest presence in rooms and has just encountered a measure that renders size irrelevant. He closed his mouth. He turned toward the parking lot to go. He had gone 3 steps when he stopped. He turned back. "The 2 men I sent Thursday," he said. "I'll make a call. It stops." And then he reached out to Hazel, not threateningly, not with intention to intimidate, but with the residual frustration of a person who has more to say, and not the words to say it, reaching toward her left arm in the way people reach toward things they want to hold on to when they are about to lose them. His fingers caught the shoulder seam of her uniform shirt instead of her arm. His momentum carried him 1 step forward as she stepped back onto the dock. The seam tore. Not a theatrical rip, a clean industrial separation, the thread line giving way at the stress point where the sleeve met the body, pulling the left side of the collar down and exposing the shoulder and the upper arm to the full Saturday afternoon light. Brick stepped back. In his hand was a strip of green fabric. He did not know yet what he had done. The parking lot changed. The change was not simultaneous. It moved outward from the dock in expanding rings, the way information moves through a space when it is carried by something visual and immediate. One person stopped pushing their cart and stood still, and then the person behind them almost walked into them and looked up and also stopped. And the people near the entrance who had been watching idly registered the stillness and turned. And within 30 seconds, the entire east-facing section of the lot had organized itself into the specific stillness of multiple people receiving the same unexpected input at the same time. Because on Hazel's left shoulder, exposed now to the Saturday afternoon sun, to the parking lot cameras, to the 15 witnesses and the phones that had risen again with the instinct that never fully went away, was a tattoo. It was compact and unornate, the kind of design made by someone who understood that meaning should not require decoration. A forward-facing eagle in sharp black and gold, its wings folded close to the body in the posture of something that does not need to spread itself to be understood as dangerous. Below the eagle, a naval trident, the symbol not of the broader Navy but of the specific community within it, the one that operated in places that did not appear in briefings accessible to most of the military hierarchy. And below the trident, in the same economical linework, 4 letters, DEVGRU. Around the tattoo's outer edge, rendered in text so small that it required proximity to read, but was permanently and indelibly present to anyone who got close enough. Kandahar, August 2009. And beneath and around the tattoo, spreading from its lower edge down along the curve of the shoulder and under the arm, a scar, not the surgical line of a blade, but the irregular, varied topography of shrapnel, the kind of wound that required field stabilization and surgical extraction and months of physical therapy, and left behind not a single clean mark, but a landscape, a geography of what a body had absorbed and rebuilt itself around. 3 seconds. Raymond had been crossing the lot when the seam tore, walking from his car with the unhurried purpose that had characterized his presence in this parking lot every day for 8 days. He reached the dock area in the time it took most of the Saturday crowd to process what they were looking at. He stopped 6 feet from Hazel, his spine straightened, all the way, the adapted back injury irrelevant, nothing in his body accommodating for this moment, and his right hand came up to his forehead in a salute. Not the casual version, not the reflexive one performed between equals of similar rank in passing. The deliberate, full-weight salute of a man who understood exactly what he was honoring. Not the rank alone, not the unit alone, but the specific and invisible weight that the letters on that shoulder represented. The operations without press releases, the years of service without acknowledgement, the cost written in the scar beneath the ink, and the deliberate choice to carry all of it in a grocery store uniform in a small Texas town, because the person who bore it had decided that was enough. He held the salute, and the effort of holding it was visible in the way it is only visible when something is genuinely meant. Brick looked at the tattoo, looked at Raymond's salute, looked back at the tattoo. The strip of green fabric in his hand became something he did not know how to hold. He opened his fingers, and it fell to the asphalt. Iris, who had been in the east lot again, a Saturday grocery run, standing 30 feet from the dock near the trunk of her car, had her phone out with the reflex that had been trained into her by the original incident. Her thumb hovered above the record button. She did not press it. Some moments were not for recording, and she understood this before she could have explained why. The understanding arrived in her body first, the specific recognition that certain things were diminished rather than preserved by being made into content. She lowered the phone. She stood and watched with her own eyes. Connor reached the dock. He stopped beside Raymond, looked at the tattoo, looked at Hazel's face, the face that had given him nothing for 8 days, that had been steady and flat and unreadable through all of it, through the confrontation and the arrest and the intimidation attempt and the legal follow-up and the media inquiries, and something in his 26-year-old chest did something he didn't have a framework for yet. He looked at the woman in the torn grocery store uniform, at the 4 letters on her shoulder and said the only honest thing he had. "Ma'am, thank you for your service." He knew the words were not equal to the moment. She probably knew it too, but they were true, and true was what he had. A man in the parking lot, broad, wearing a Callaway County VFW t-shirt, who had arrived to pick up his wife and was now standing near the cart, returned with his keys in his hand, found his voice first among the crowd. "DEVGRU," he said, his voice careful, the word carrying the weight of someone who had spent time in proximity to what it meant. "SEAL Team 6? Hazel looked at him. He worked through whatever was happening in his chest. "My brother-in-law was Team 3. He told me once." He stopped, started again. He said DevGru was the place that sent people to do what couldn't be done any other way. His voice had gone quiet in the way voices go quiet when they're handling something fragile. He had a lot of respect for the people in that unit. "Your brother-in-law is right," Hazel said. "Please thank him for his service." The man squared his shoulders and nodded with a gravity that looked slightly out of place against the backdrop of shopping carts and weekend parking lot noise, but which was entirely appropriate to what it was. A person placing something in the column it belonged in, permanently, where it would not be revised. Raymond lowered his salute. Brick said, "I'm sorry." 2 words. No architecture around them. No legal insulation. No management of impression. They came out the way things come out when the weight of carrying them becomes heavier than the discomfort of releasing them, plainly, and with no exit strategy built in. About the man in the wheelchair, about what I did. He looked at the tattoo on her shoulder, at the scar, and then looked away, because looking at it felt like something he had not earned. "I grew up hard. That's not an excuse. I know it's not." He was quiet for a moment. "I didn't know what kind of person you were." "You don't have to know what kind of person someone is," Hazel said quietly, "to know that what you're doing to them is wrong." The sentence didn't lecture. It didn't moralize. It arrived at its destination the way true things arrive, without fanfare, addressed directly to the person who needed to receive it. Brick received it the way a person receives something they cannot unseat without arguing against themselves. He nodded. Connor placed him in the direction of his car. Brick walked away across the Saturday parking lot, his shadow cast long by the afternoon angle, and he did not look back. And he made the call he had said he would make, and the sedan that had been circling Fort Calloway's block for 3 days did not appear again. Before we get to where the story ends, today's episode is brought to you by Covenant Coffee, small batch roasted and delivered directly to your door. Covenant Coffee was founded by a veteran, roasted by veterans, and $1 from every bag goes directly to veteran mental health programs. These are people who understand what it means to come home and what it takes to keep going afterward. Use the code VALOR at checkout for 20% off your first order. The link is in the description below. Now back to Fort Calloway, Texas, and the piece of this story that has been waiting since the night it began. The charges held, which was the foundational consequence, the one that determined the shape of everything that came after. Brick, Danny, Floyd, and Garnett were arraigned in Callaway County District Court the following month. The specific details of the plea agreements varied, but the shared architecture was community service, fines, probation, and a 2-year stay-away order from the Ridgeline Shopping Center and its parking lot. Brick's attorney had advised each of them, with patient precision, that the video evidence was comprehensive. The witness list ran to 14 names, and the specific facts of the case: disabled veteran victim, verified SEAL Team 6 operator as intervening witness, documented intimidation follow-up, did not create a favorable landscape for a contested defense. The district attorney, Grace Holloway, 11 years in her position, familiar with most of what Fort Calloway's legal geography produced, announced the outcomes briefly and added, without having been directly asked, that the case had clarified certain obligations this office has toward victims who cannot physically defend themselves. It was a sentence she meant, and people who heard it in the right sequence could trace it backward to a parking lot and a silver challenge coin, and a woman who had not stepped away when stepping away was easier. This was the 5th layer of consequence, the institutional one. It would not have existed without the first 4. The 4th layer came from the community, and it came in the form of a collective embarrassment that is more durably transformative than simple outrage. Outrage resolves. Embarrassment stays in the room with you. The 15 people who had stood at the entrance with their phones raised on the afternoon of the incident, some of them had been visible in the background of the video, and Fort Calloway was a small town, and small towns remembered. Nobody publicly condemned them. That was not how it worked. What happened instead was the social equivalent of a steady, quiet light being shined on a particular corner of a room. Conversations that briefly paused when certain people entered them. A slight adjustment in temperature at certain tables. Several of those 15 people turned up at the County Volunteer Services office in the weeks following, asking about veteran programs. The coordinator, Martha, a woman who had been in her role for 22 years and who had seen most things, accepted their names on the list without commentary. The third layer was professional and arrived for Brick in an unexpected direction. He worked for a logistics company whose owner was a Vietnam veteran with 2 sons in the Navy Reserve. The owner called Brick into his office the week after arraignment and conducted a 45-minute conversation that Brick would describe afterward as the hardest he'd ever sat through. Brick kept his position. The owner was not a person who decided things in heat, but spent 3 months on reduced hours and a performance plan that included, at the owner's personal insistence, monthly volunteer shifts at the county's Veteran Services Center, providing transportation for veterans who needed medical transport. He showed up for the first shift skeptically. He showed up for the second one without being reminded. By the 4th month, he had begun to stay after his required hours, helping with equipment repair for veterans whose adapted vehicles needed maintenance. It was not a redemption narrative. It was a person doing work because work needed doing. And finding that useful labor has a way of reorganizing what you believe you are. The second layer was personal, and it was quiet. Danny relocated to Austin within 2 months. Floyd changed very little outwardly, which was its own consequence. The kind measured in what a person was still carrying, unchanged, when they left a situation without having understood it. Garnett became quieter, and the quietness looked more honest on him than the performance of aggression had. He began attending Sunday services at a small church on the east side of Fort Calloway, not because he had been told to, but because he was looking for a place where certain kinds of conversations were possible, and that was the place he found. The first layer, the immediate one, the one everything else extended from, was Otis Marshall, who got his pharmacy bag back and went home, and the following Tuesday sat in the third parking space from the left and unlocked his van without looking over his shoulder. The fact that he did not look over his shoulder was the whole of what he had wanted back, and it had been returned to him. Sick. The news blog ran an updated headline Monday morning. Ridgeline employee confirmed as former SEAL Team 6 operator, Fort Calloway responds. The article was careful and specific, and contained one anonymously sourced quote from a person who had been in the parking lot Saturday. She adjusted her torn shirt with 2 fingers and went back to the delivery manifest. That's the moment I'll remember. The original video changed character in its comment section over the following week. The threads debating techniques stopped. The threads trying to identify her military background stopped. What replaced them were longer, more private things. The comments people write when a space feels like it will hold what they have to say without performing it back at them. A disabled veteran of Operation Iraqi Freedom wrote 4 paragraphs about the specific experience of existing in public in a wheelchair, and the daily small arithmetic of what people's eyes told you about how they assessed you, and what it meant to have a person stand in front of you who required none of that assessment to decide what they were going to do. A woman wrote, "My brother died at Kandahar in August 2009. I don't know if she knew him. I don't need to know. I just want her to know that people remember." A commenter who gave no identifying information wrote, "DevGru operators don't speak publicly about themselves, but they know who their own are. She knows we know." Iris read through these comments on her lunch break on Tuesday and found herself in the specific state of emotion that doesn't announce itself. Tears without drama, the kind that come from something landing that has been waiting to land. She shared the video one final time with a caption that read, "I was there. She never wanted any of this attention. Some people do what's right because it's right, not because anyone is watching. I was the one watching. I want that to count for something." The caption was shared 90,000 times by the end of the week. Albert came to the stockroom on Tuesday afternoon and stood in the doorway with the particular posture of a manager who has something to say and would prefer not to have to say it, but has concluded it is the right thing. He asked if Hazel wanted the following week off. Paid, given everything. "I'd rather work," she said. "Of course you would," he said, in the tone of a man confirming a prediction he had made in advance. He stood for another moment, turning his clipboard in his hands. "The store has received a number of calls. People wanting to express—" He cleared his throat. "Several people have asked if they could leave gifts, cards. One person asked if they could donate to a veteran fund in your name. Please thank them and let them know I don't need anything. Understood?" He turned to go, then came back. "Hazel, for what it's worth." He stopped, started again with better materials. "I hired you because your references were the most thorough I'd ever seen, and your availability was open. I didn't ask questions because—" His clipboard gesture covered the entire territory of because some people clearly don't want questions asked, and respecting that is part of being a decent employer. "But I want you to know, you are the most reliable, most precise, and most genuinely useful employee in this building. Not because of what happened in the parking lot, not because of what's on your shoulder, because you show up, do the work, and never make it someone else's problem." He paused, having delivered himself to the end of the prepared remarks and found nothing further. "That has real value. Whatever else is true." Hazel looked at him. "Thank you, Albert." He nodded and left in the quick way of people who have said something honest and need to be elsewhere before the aftermath catches up with them. Daisy, emerging from behind a pallet of paper towels where she had been present during this exchange in a technically coincidental capacity, looked at the space Albert had vacated. "He means it," she said. "I know." Hazel picked up her inventory sheet. A pause. Then Daisy carefully. "Kandahar, 2009. "No," Hazel said. Daisy nodded. She picked up her own clipboard and fell in beside Hazel for the afternoon count, and they worked through the stockroom in the particular companionable silence that develops between people who have stopped needing to fill space and have arrived instead at something quieter and more durable than conversation. It was, Hazel thought, without identifying the thought as something worth holding, one of the better parts of Fort Calloway, the people who learned when to leave the questions alone. Otis Marshall came back the following Tuesday. He came because it was Tuesday, and because he had been coming to this pharmacy on Tuesdays for 7 years, and because the decision to return to the third space from the left and do the weekly business of staying alive was not, in his assessment, something 4 men in a pickup truck were entitled to take from him. He parked, activated the lift, settled himself in his chair, collected the pharmacy bag, locked the van. He turned toward the entrance. Hazel was at the loading dock, not waiting. She was midway through signing a delivery manifest, the truck driver beside her, the clipboard moving with its usual efficiency. But she had seen his van pull in because she always saw everything that entered the east lot, and she had walked out onto the dock instead of staying at the window, which was not her usual practice, and which meant something that did not require explicit acknowledgement to be understood by either of them. Otis navigated across the lot with the practiced ease of 7 years of Tuesday muscle memory. He stopped at the edge of the loading area and looked up. She reached into her left jacket pocket, the interior one, with the zipper where things could not fall out, and held out the challenge coin. The worn silver face caught the afternoon light, the 173rd Airborne Shield familiar and small in her palm. Otis looked at it. "You kept it. I wasn't sure it was meant for me. It was meant for you." He reached up and took it from her hand and then, without pocketing it, held it out again, flat on his palm. The same coin, a different offer. 56 years, he said. "I've been carrying it since 68. I took it off the first man I saw do the right thing when doing nothing would have been easier." His voice was steady and unhurried, the voice of a man who has had a long time to arrive at what he wants to say. "I've been waiting for the right place to leave it, and I left it in the right place." Hazel looked at the coin in his palm. She had built 14 months of careful architecture around the project of not being in exactly this kind of moment, the kind that required a person to receive something real from another real person without deflecting it into the administrative, the procedural, the practical. The project had been, in its own terms, successful. Ridgeline Grocery was a place where she could exist without being required to be seen. The parking lot had dismantled most of that construction in 8 days. She looked at Otis's face, the lines in it, the caisson year somewhere in the depth of his eyes, the specific expression of a man who had survived his war and buried most of the people he had survived it with, and continued, on the basis of some stubbornness she recognized, to show up every Tuesday in the third parking space from the left. She looked at the coin. She took it back. She closed her hand around it. The weight of it, the smoothed eagle, the year on the back. 68. The year a coin had first changed hands between two people who understood what it meant to stand between a wrong thing and the person it was being done to, without being required to. "Thank you," she said. The quietest 2 words she had said in 14 months. Otis gripped his wheels. Over his shoulder, he said, "Same time next Tuesday." Hazel looked at the parking lot, at the loading dock, at the afternoon light on the asphalt and the specific ordinary geography of Fort Calloway, Texas, which had been for 14 months enough, and had become in the last 8 days something more complicated and more real and less perfectly controlled than enough. "Same time next Tuesday," she said. But check. 3 weeks after the parking lot, a Thursday evening in late August. The heat still pressing down on the town, the cicadas escalating in the dry grass beyond the fence, the Texas sky doing the thing it did at summer's end where the colors went excessive, deep orange into purple, into the particular blue that looked painted rather than real, the kind of sky that made even people who lived under it stop and look. Hazel clocked out at 8 p.m., collected Diesel from the break room where he had been sleeping under the corner table, and walked through the loading dock to the employee lot behind the building. She sat on the concrete dock step, the same step she had sat on with Raymond 2 weeks ago, when she had asked what kind of help he meant. Diesel settled against her left side, his warm weight against her ribs, the quality of his presence unchanged by any of the 14 months in between whatever they had been before and whatever this was. She reached into her jacket pocket and closed her hand around the coin. The back lot was quiet. A security light over the dock made its yellow claim on the asphalt. Beyond the fence, August grass stretched dry and brown to a tree line. A radio tower somewhere to the east blinked red at intervals, regular as a pulse. The evening smelled of warm concrete and cedar, and the faint petrochemical distance of the highway 2 miles out. It looked like peace. Not the absence of things, but the presence of something specific, the quality of a place where nothing was required of you in this exact moment. A quality she had spent 14 months trying to install into her daily life, and had, largely, managed. The coin in her hand had cost her some of that. The incident had cost her more, but she was still here, in the same town, working the same shift, and Diesel's weight against her side was the same as it had always been, which was the continuity that mattered most. Her phone buzzed. She looked at the screen. Unknown number. Area code 361. Corpus Christi Corridor, Naval Air Station, Kingsville Territory. The routing geography of naval special warfare operations she had mapped years ago and never fully unmapped. The number was not in her contacts. Some numbers didn't need to be in contacts to be recognized. They lived in the body the way certain skills did, below the level of deliberate memory. The phone buzzed a second time. A third. Diesel raised his head and looked at her. On the fourth ring, she answered. "Go 7. The voice was male, professional, compressed with the brevity of someone whose conversations had always been conducted with the understanding that every word carried operational weight. Not a voice she recognized individually, but recognizable by type. The construction of it, the way it combined familiarity with respect in proportions that spoke of rank and history, and a community's specific relationship to its own. We saw the video. The cicadas in the August grass. The blinking tower. The yellow circle of the security light. "Who gave you this number?" she said. "People who care about what happens to you." A pause calibrated rather than uncertain. "Including some who were in Kandahar in August 2009. One of them has been trying to locate you for 2 years. She held the coin, the year in its back face. 68. A different August. A different person's decision about what they were willing to stand in front of. "I left," she said. "You left the unit." The voice on the other end did not push. It placed information in the air and allowed it to sit. "You didn't stop being who you are. What do you want? There's a situation developing, in a region you know, people who can't be reached through conventional channels. A pause. We're not asking you to rejoin. We're asking if you would be willing to consult, off the record. Your terms, your timeline, no obligation beyond what you explicitly agree to. Hazel looked at the dry field beyond the fence, at the tower blinking its steady red, at the dark above the tree line where the stars were beginning to appear the way they appeared in August in Texas. Suddenly, all at once, as if the day had been withholding them. How many people? She said, the old reflex. Not yes or no. The specific clarifying question of someone who is already thinking operationally, who had moved past the question of whether and into the question of what it required. That's classified at this stage. Approximately. A pause. Single digits. She ran the calculation. Not whether she would, but what the shape of it would be. What she would need to know before any decision could be made honestly. What the variables were that she could not yet see from here. It was a kind of thinking she had believed, for 14 months, was behind her. It was not behind her. It had been waiting with the same patience Diesel waited. Quiet, attentive, requiring nothing, simply present. I need information before I agree to anything, she said. You'll have it within 48 hours. My terms are my terms. They don't become negotiable after I agree to something. Understood and accepted. She looked at Diesel. He was looking back at her with the amber-eyed attention he had given her in the field, and in the hospital, and in the months after, and in the two-bedroom house, and in the stockroom. And here, on a concrete step behind a grocery store in a small Texas town, with exactly the same quality, absolute undemanding, the presence of something that had decided where it was going to be, and was simply being there. Send me what you have, she said. Thank you, Ghost 7. She ended the call. She sat for a moment with the phone in one hand and the coin in the other, the cicadas loud now in the full dark, the security light holding its yellow ground. Diesel put his chin on her knee. She rested her palm on top of his head and felt his warmth and the specific steadiness of him. The radio tower blinked. The stars were out. Yeah, she said. I know. She stood, pocketed the phone, moved the coin to the interior pocket with the zipper, where it would not fall out, where it would be with her wherever she went next. She looked at the field one more time. The dry August grass, the tree line, the ordinary dark of a town that had been, for 14 months, enough. She picked up Diesel's leash. Come on, she said. Let's go home. They walked across the back lot and through the gate and into the street, and the security light shone on the empty step behind them, and Fort Calloway, Texas went about its August evening, the cicadas and the cooling asphalt and the radio tower and the stars, not knowing, as it rarely knew the things that mattered, what was walking through its streets in the dark, carrying a challenge coin and a classified phone number, and 14 months of quietly rebuilt ordinary life, and a decision that was not yet made, but that was closer to being made than it had been this morning. Some people spend years making themselves small so the world will leave them alone, not because they're afraid of the world, but because they understand, with the specific precision of people who have operated in places most people will never see, exactly what they carry and have chosen deliberately to carry it quietly. Otis Marshall understood that on a Tuesday afternoon when he looked up from his wheelchair and saw a woman standing between him and 4 men who intended him harm, not a figure from a story, not a hero performing for an audience, just a person in a grocery store uniform who had made a decision, without announcement, that this was not something she was going to walk past. The tattoo tells you what she was trained to do. The coin tells you who she chose to be. The coin is in her pocket now. And wherever she goes from here, whatever she agrees to, on her terms, in her timeline, through the 48 hours of incoming information and the calculation that follows, she carries it with her. Real service doesn't seek recognition. It just shows up.